Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Professor Johnson, who is one of the experts instructed by the inquiry. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Good morning to you. Good morning, members of the panel. I now call Professor Christopher Johnson, please.
Good morning, Professor Johnson.
Good morning.
I understand you're going to take the oath.
I am.
There should be a testament on your right there. Would you take it in your right hand, please, and read the words on the screen?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, please sit down.
Thank you.
Make yourself comfortable. Sorry, we've got a hiccup, Mr. Millett, I'm afraid, because the Resistance Fund screen is, the document screen is blank, which I think you're switched on. You've got a green light. This is what happens, isn't it, Professor Johnson, with technology?
Technology, yes.
It catches you out. I suppose you're plugged in, are you? Ah, at least you're live now. The keynote's been a bit exuberant, do you think? Sorry, I didn't notice it when it came in. Thank you very much, Felipe. All right. I think we've solved it, probably. Right. Mr. Millett, I think we've solved it, so on you go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Professor Johnson.
Good morning.
You've prepared a report for this inquiry entitled Assessment of the Design and Operation of Fireground Communications Systems Available at Grenfell Tower on the Night of the Fire. Correct?
Yes.
And it's dated the 27th of November 2020. And let's have it on the screen, CWJ 50119, please. Is that your report to the inquiry?
It is.
Can you confirm that the facts and matters set out in it are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can.
Have you provided a report in the same way that you would provide an expert's report to the court in this country?
I have.
Does your report faithfully set out your opinions on matters which are relevant to this inquiry?
It does.
And have you read the report recently?
I have, yes.
Now, if we can go, please, to page, section 174, sorry, section 1.4. If we go to that, please, which we will find on page 14. You set out your disclosure of interests and a brief review of your background, and we also find that, I think, in Appendix A at page 278. And I just want to draw some key points from your CV. Can I just run through some of the headlines with you and ask you to confirm or disagree or qualify as the case may be? Am I right that you're currently a Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Faculty of Engineering and Physical Sciences at Queen's University, Belfast?
I am.
And you've held that position since July 2020?
I have.
And is it right that before that you were Head of Computing Science at the University of Glasgow between 2014 and 2020?
I was.
Is it right that you've also held previous positions in computing science, including at the University of Glasgow between 1994 and 2014?
Yes.
Yes. And before that, the University of York between 1991 and 1994?
Yes.
And you hold, I think is right, amongst other qualifications, a Master of Science in Information Processing?
I have.
Yes. And a Doctor of Philosophy in Computing Science?
I do.
And as I understand it, your DPhil thesis explored the roles that human factors play in control systems. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, yes.
And is it right also that throughout your career you have researched and lectured on safety critical systems?
Yes.
and also safety and communications projects for major organisations, including GCHQ, the Ministry of Defence, the United States Navy, and NASA.
Yes.
And in relation to your work on communication systems, is it right also that you've previously advised on communications failures following major incidents such as the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and in London 7/7?
Yes,
And I think it's right that in 2011 you were awarded a NASA fellowship.
I was.
And in 2019 you were appointed Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh.
I was.
Now, thank you, can I look at the purpose of your report? Can we please go to page 15 and look at paragraph 2.1? You set out there, under the heading Methods, Findings and Recommendations, your instructions. In general, can you confirm for us, please, that the purpose of your report is to assess the design, operation and efficacy of the communication systems adopted by the LFB at the Grenfell Tower fire?
I can confirm that.
And in conducting that analysis, is it right that you examined not only the technical and operational characteristics of the LFB's communications equipment, but also the LFB's overarching communications systems?
Yes.
And in preparing your report, I think it's right that you've had access to witness statements and documents provided to the inquiry.
I have.
And am I also right that you have, in part at least, proceeded on the footing of the findings in the chairman's Phase 1 report?
Yes, very much so.
Yes. And considered also matters and documents from your own expertise and professional experience, and you've identified those clearly in the body of your report or in their footnotes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, during your evidence today, what I would like to do, if I may, is to ask you some explanatory questions about the main communications technology deployed by the LFB as at the night of the fire, 14th of June 2017. And then we will look after that at the challenges or problems that high-rise firefighting can pose in respect of communications. And then we will turn later to the way in which you suggest that those challenges can be overcome or mitigated. I'm going to start then with the LFB's radio technology and its inherent limitations. And within that, the first topic I'd like to look at with you, if I may, is the subject of handheld radios. First, is it right that the London Fire Brigade's radios relied on two main forms of radio communication technology? First, ultra-high frequency, or UHF technology, which was analogue, and second, Airwave technology, which was digital.
Yes.
Now, we'll look at those and their differences in some more detail as we go, but for current purposes, would it be accurate for me to summarise their different uses in the following way? First, UHF radio was, at the time of the fire, the radio relied on by the majority of firefighters on the incident ground.
Yes.
Whereas airwave radios were held by, or at least possessed by, senior officers, and were the means by which the incident ground would be able to communicate with the control room or other emergency responders.
Yes.
Yes. And am I right that Airwave was also known as the main scheme radio?
That's correct.
Now, let's look at ultra-high frequency, or UHF, radio in a little bit more detail. Now, I think your report discusses two types of UHF radio device. Is this right? The first is a handheld personal radio carried by all LFB firefighters, which is like a walkie-talkie.
Yes.
And the second type of radio is that which formed part of the LFB's breathing apparatus, or BA, known as a Barry set.
Yes.
BARIE.
That's correct.
Yes. Now, we'll come on to look at the differences between those in due course, but just want to focus, if I can, on the UHF technology. Now, you've identified the fact that the UHF is an analogue technology rather than digital. Could you tell us, in layman's terms, if you can, what the differences are between analogue technology and digital?
Sound can be viewed as a waveform, sinusoidal, and analog, if you like, samples that. But with the digital approach, it takes that analog wave and breaks it into digital values of ones and zeros, and then transmits it in a way that's analogous to how a computer would translate information. It's first of all encoded into ones and zeros, and then decoded into a sound that we can recognise in normal hearing, if you like. and the translation into ones and zeros offers advantages in some ways in terms of encryption and in terms of integration with the internet protocol and so forth. So, however, Airwave as a technology itself was developed before many of the more recent advances in computational infrastructure, and so some of the possibilities of digital communication are not available as they were deployed on the night of the fire, for instance.
Right. Now, you, I think, explained that UHF radios operate in something called Simplex mode.
Yes.
And you explain what Simplex mode is when you describe the Barry radio set at sections 7.4.2 and 3 of your report. Can we just look at those, please, at page 181? And on 181, you see at 7.4.2, you say, only one party at a time can talk, while others listen until they hear an opportunity to transmit. The limited power of these devices means that it is often impossible to cover an entire incident ground with simplex communications. Signal coverage weakens with distance and with obstructions between radios. Now, we'll come to look at signal coverage shortly, but for the moment, does simplex mode play any part in the power of a radio device?
It does, in the sense that if you're communicating between two handheld radios, then there is a finite distance based on the power of the radio between which that communication signal will transmit. Other forms of communication, as are illustrated in the diagram below, can have repeaters and other forms of technology that then extend that signal, but it's not going from one handset to another handset.
We'll look at that in a moment.
Great.
Because it's not on the screen, but we'll look at the diagram. But I think what you're telling us, is this right, is that if you're in simplex mode, it may limit or the distance between handsets that can be used.
Simplex mode is simply a form of communication which is one way in direction, rather than obviously duplex, which has two forms of both one channel for transmit and another channel for receive. So in some ways it's orthogonal to the power. But in general, the issue would be the power of handheld to handheld communication without any form of infrastructure to extend that signal.
I see.
Would it be right to understand that simplex mode means that one person transmits while other people receive?
Exactly.
And if someone who is listening wants to break in and transmit, is he prevented from doing that, or does he effectively cut off the first transmitter?
It depends on the situation, but in normal circumstances, they would potentially cut off the other transmitter by taking over the bandwidth, or there would be a signal distortion through that contention for the bandwidth.
Right. Yes, thank you.
And following that up, what would happen if two users tried to transmit messages at the same time?
The same thing. It would effectively cause interference between the two signals.
Right. And what would happen to the message of the person who was unable to transmit? Would it just get lost?
Yes, it would, and potentially also obscure the first responder as well.
Right.
Talking over is the phrase that people often use.
Would the unsuccessful party, so to speak, have any way of knowing that their communication had failed?
It would depend on. So normally people refer to things like radio discipline, which is where somebody will say a message and then give a keyword, typically something like over, that then says, I'm finished, you can go next. So in the situation where somebody spoke over a person who was delivering a message, that could arise if, for instance, they hadn't heard that the first person was already using that channel, for example, and felt that they could then, that the airways, if you like, were free for them to talk at that point.
Would the where radios allow more than one party to transmit at a time, I think is this right, duplex mode?
Duplex, in the circumstances that we see with these radios, doesn't mean that more than one person can speak at any one time. It means that there will be one person speaking, but another channel will be used to hear information coming back. And so it may be possible for somebody to say something that is then heard, but it doesn't offer multi-party talking because there's still only one channel for transmission. So this is sometimes, as the diagram below will show you, is called half duplex.
Yes. Well, let's have that on the screen because I'm going to look at that now with you. But before I do, can I just ask you this? Is it possible to have or to find UHF radios that transmit in duplex mode?
It is.
And do you know how long those have been available on the market?
I don't know. That would be
Right.
something that would be...
Let's look at the diagram at the bottom of page 181, where you've got figure 7.1, differences between simplex and half duplex. Just in summary, that's where the radios transmit to a repeater in frequency A, which I think, is this right, receives in A, but transmits to each in B, and the radios receive the signal from the repeater in frequency B.
Yep.
Yes. And what are the advantages of half duplex mode?
It enables you to extend the distance between the handheld walkie-talkies. So, as the name repeater suggests, it repeats the message onwards to a recipient that may be distributed further. And it extends what in the report I've referred to as a signal localization effect.
Yes, and is it possible for UHF radios to use half duplex mode, or does that require a radio repeater?
It requires a radio repeater in the architecture that we have here.
Now, if you go to page 43 of your report, please, let's look at section 3.2.15 together. You say there, it's in the middle of the screen, a wide range of factors influence radio propagation. Shadowing occurs when an object blocks a signal, attenuation when an object reduces the strength of a signal, reflection when a signal is propagated from an object, and diffraction when the path of a signal is altered by an object. I think it's also right that you go on to say that there are other factors as well, such as the density and composition of surrounding materials, including a building's construction.
Yes.
Yes, meteorological factors, including weather.
Yes.
And you cover that at 3.2.17, and the presence of fire itself.
Yes.
Yes. Now, we'll look at some of those factors in more detail a little bit later, but for the moment, can we take it from the list that you set out there in your report, that it's common for UHF radio messages to be either degraded or blocked entirely by any one of those factors?
Yes, depending on the environment.
Yes. And what practical impact would the degradation or blocking of a signal have on the sender or the recipient of a radio message?
For both parties, it creates the possibility that their message, first of all, may not be transmitted correctly to the recipient, and the recipient may not hear that message clearly or in full. It effectively degrades communication.
Right. And so, for example, in the presence of fire, what would it do to the sound of the transmitting voice?
Again, it could create interference, and as I said in the report, the actual relationship between fire and the nature of that interference is not well understood. It's widely accepted that there is an effect, but to me it remains an area of significant research that should really be conducted given the context of this inquiry.
And now if we go to page 96 of your report, please, let's look at section 5.1.3. You've referred to what we've just discussed, I think, is this right, signal localization?
Yes.
Yes. And at that paragraph, you say, in this context, signal localization refers to the failure of low-powered radio signals to propagate beyond the immediate vicinity of the team generating them. This localization reduces the problems which might otherwise occur when signals from one team propagated to interfere with those of another. Now that, am I right, suggests that keeping radio signals at a relatively low power might be an intentional strategy by organisations. Is that what you intend to say?
Yes, very much so.
Right. Then let's look on at page 142, please. Let's look there at section 6.6.5. You say, and this is in the context of Barry radios, but you say signal localization could have helped communications by limiting propagation to small work groups so that everyone hears the messages of their colleagues within their work group. First, does it follow from that using signal localization as an intentional strategy effectively amounts to relying on the fact that radio signals will only transmit so far, and therefore will only be received by specific work groups.
Yes.
And so perhaps by way of example, in a high-rise context, would the idea be that radio messages of firefighters on the top floors of a building are unlikely to be received by the radios of firefighters at the base of the building who are working on a separate task, or perhaps by a low bridgehead?
I think that's the case, but I don't think that was thought through in many of the documents that I've seen in terms of what the effects of that would be to what we refer to as situation awareness across the whole of the fire ground.
Do you mean by that incident commanders didn't turn their minds to the fact that signal localization meant that firefighters high in the building might not be able to hear people transmitting from low down in the building?
I think that signal localization was intended to be effective within a number of small working groups, but I think that the scale of the response created communication problems that had not been anticipated for the reasons that you describe, but also because the more powerful UHF radios that I'm sure we'll come on to discuss also suffered communication problems, and they were intended to provide another way of linking beyond the scope of the signal localization for the Barry sets, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Now, turning back to the question of working groups,
yes.
Are you referring to here really the practice of dividing users up into small groups who are geographically proximate?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so a work group would not work, is this right, because of signal localization, if you were going to divide it into two and send half of it to the top of a high-rise building and keep the second half in the bottom?
The extent or range of the communication would not be sufficient in many cases in that situation, yes.
Yes. When you were preparing your report, did you see any evidence to indicate that at the Grenfell Tower fire, the LFB was intentionally trying to utilise signal localisation in order to limit radio signals to particular groups of BA teams?
I think that the evidence I saw was that this was part of the pre-operational planning, but that on the night of the fire, at least in the early stages, it seemed that communications were effective within work groups. But then as the night progressed, it was not always the case that firefighters had Barry radios as they entered the building, even when they were working in teams. And so some teams had no Barry radios. And those initial working teams that may have been conceived in the early stages became more distributed. Communications became more difficult. And in answer to your question fully, there are more complex aspects which relate to the use of different channels between the BA teams, channels, and to Channel 3, which was used effectively in some cases between work groups on the night of the fire. But the impression I got from the witness statements was that those arrangements became less sufficient during the course of the fire as communication problems increased. And I think that contributed to, as I said before, loss of situation awareness that's noted by many of the witnesses.
Now, at the beginning of that answer, you referred to pre-operational planning. Was that pre-operational planning for a fire at Grenfell Tower, or are you referring to some wider policy or planning arrangement?
I mean the wider policy and planning, not things like the pre-site inspections and the ORD entries, for example. So,
well, for Grenfell Tower specifically, or for other buildings?
For other, I think that the planning was for general high-rise fires in the sense of national guidance, such as GR 3.2 and similar documents.
Right. So when you refer to the pre-ops planning, are you talking about policy, either at national or at brigade level?
Yes.
Yes, I see.
Yes.
Now, can we then please turn to page 53?
Can you just help me with this? If I'm understanding your evidence correctly, you're telling us that those who use UHF analog systems must be aware that they have a limited range, to
Yes.
put it in layman's terms.
Yes.
And that can be useful because it means you can confine those who are taking part in the communications to a certain group within a certain geographical range.
Yes,
And it becomes a problem if you're trying to extend it beyond that geographical range.
exactly.
Is it possible to give us any indication of the sort of range within which those systems could be expected to work effectively in a high-rise building? Or is it all too dependent on the structure of the building?
It's a fantastic question, and I wish I could give you a simple, straightforward answer. But the way I feel about it, having reviewed the evidence that's been provided to me by the inquiry, is that there is an urgent need. As I mentioned before, for example, the impact of fire on communication is not well understood, and obviously has a tremendous effect in the context of this incident. But I feel that there is strong opportunity in the aftermath of this fire to make a contribution and reduce the risks of future fires by developing methods that enable us to answer your question in a more satisfactory way than was done prior to this fire. In other words, I think it's not that it could not be done, it's that it has not been done, and that I think if we applied our minds, we would be able to come up with far better predictions to answer your question before a fire on a building-by-building basis.
Well, that's helpful, and I think I'm in danger now of anticipating Mr. Millett's last question, but I'm going to take the risk, because you referred to the pre-planning stage, and I just wonder whether in the material that you've seen, you saw a conscious recognition of the position that you've just described, namely that you can use this system within a certain geographical area, no doubt affected by the building and the fire and everything else, but not if you get beyond it. Were people, as far as you could see, aware of this problem?
Yes, a very specific example would be there's a continual reference throughout policy documents nationally and within the brigade to blind spots within high-rise buildings, and most commonly they're associated with methods of construction in high-rises. So I think there's a general awareness. I think there's one aspect that I would talk about, which is that the signal localization works well within working teams, but as soon as you put more and more people into the same location, then that localization is eroded because too many people are trying to contend for the same channel. And so it's not just the blind spots, it's also the congestion, which I feel it's the combination of these different aspects, the construction creating blind spots and the power that means that you can't communicate with the bridgehead further down the building, and then the sheer number of users in a defined locality. So in the report I've referred to this as a systemic kind of explanation where you take these different factors, which were all a problem on the night of the fire, I think, and place the firefighters in a very difficult position, is my view.
Thank you very much. That's helpful.
Yes. Can we then look at page 53, please, of your report? And on that page, you can see the heading, which is I won't read out to you, and some key findings. And at paragraphs 4.1.2 and 4.1.3, you set out key findings there, particularly about limitation of power of output and signal localization helping reduce congestion. And then at 4.1.4, you say this: these benefits were lost in Grenfell Tower because so many teams were deployed in close proximity that the channel became congested and interference occurred. Are you referring here to BA teams being deployed to the same floor or to upper and lower floors?
It's very difficult to be, certainly within the same floor that would be true, but also because radio waves propagate in different directions in the ways that were described in our previous answer, it could still occur between floors as well if people were adjacent and trying to communicate with each other. The conflict between the communication would still occur in that situation too. In other words, if they're in too close a proximity and they try to communicate, even though they're in different working groups, their messages will conflict in the way that we described.
Yes. Now, building on that, if one accepts as a starting assumption that it's a likely scenario in a high-rise fire that you are going to have BA teams on different floors of a high-rise building. Would it be fair to say that the potential benefits of signal localization are unlikely to be realised in the context of fighting a fire in a high-rise building?
Yes. And I would also say that some of these issues were revealed in previous incidents that are described in the report, such as 9/11, for example.
Yes. Can I then turn to Barry sets and the concept of intrinsically safe?
Yes.
Can we go, please, to paragraph 44? Sorry, page 44, paragraph 3.3.3 of your report. And, Professor, I apologise for jumping around, but we're going to be doing that for much of the day.
Thank you.
Now, you set out here an explanation that the two types of UHF radio used by the LFB, handheld radios and the Barry sets, operate at a different wattage. I think it's right that the Barry set operates at 1 watt, whereas the handheld personal radios operate at 4 watts.
Yes.
Yes? And the handheld radios are the HX 480 and 481.
Yes.
Yeah. Could you briefly outline what impact that power difference has on a radio's signal strength?
In general terms, the higher the wattage, the greater the power of the handset to communicate.
And so, in terms of its practical impact, where the signal strength is reduced, would it be right to say that radio signals and messages would be unable to travel as far as those using stronger signals?
In general, yes.
In general, and the weaker signals might not be able to penetrate through walls and floors, particularly where they're made of concrete or steel.
Yes.
And as a result, is it right that radio messages simply may not reach their intended destinations?
Yes.
Now, am I right also in thinking that these problems may arise with all UHF radio signals, but they're much more likely to arise where the signal strength is weaker?
Yes, that would be my interpretation.
Now, you discuss the concept of intrinsic safety, or IS, in your report. Could you explain again, if you can, in layman's terms, what intrinsic safety is?
Intrinsic safety is a term that is used to describe the suitability of a communication device, in this case, for use typically in an explosive or flammable environment. And in general terms, it relates to the possibility that that device might be the cause of a fire or an extinction or an explosion. And there are different. Sorry, I don't know how much detail you would like, but there are different categories depending on the nature of the substances, and the Home Office specifies a particular level of intrinsic safety for use in particular sorts of flammable environments.
And I think you've set that out elsewhere in your report,
Yes.
in a table.
Yes.
You have. We'll come to that. Can we go to page 42 of your report and look at paragraph 3.2.5? And you say there, just above the table, which we'll look at the bottom of the screen, but you say there at 3.2.5, a fire needs a fuel, oxygen, and an ignition source. The power of the Barry sets was deliberately limited to reduce the likelihood that the equipment might provide a fire's ignition source.
Yes.
Is that power, or perhaps wattage limitation, what makes a radio intrinsically safe?
It is possible to have higher powered radios that are also categorized as intrinsically safe, but in general, the higher the power, then the lower the level of intrinsic safety. And so by increasing the power of an intrinsically safe device, it may not be suitable for use in all explosive or flammable environments. And the categorization I provided in the report provides an indication of that.
Yes. And would it follow from what you've just explained to us that these intrinsically safe Barry sets with lower power, at 1 watt I think, would have an increased chance of signal difficulty?
Yes.
And you go on, I think, to explain at 3.2.8, lower down your screen, that it is possible to procure IS radios that also offer higher levels of power, and you've just made that point just now. Does it follow from that there isn't a universal standard of intrinsic safety?
It's more that there are standards for categorization of levels of intrinsic safety, and the levels can be demonstrated through a series of tests, for example, that show a particular device meets that level of intrinsic safety. But as it says in the report, there's typically a trade-off in terms of the power versus the level of intrinsic safety. So, again, as I said a minute ago, the higher the level of intrinsic safety that you are looking for, then the more protection it offers you in an explosive environment, and then in general the lower power it tends to be. So these are all generalizations, but that illustrates the trade-offs that are made.
Just on that, would the 1 watt limitation on the power of the Barry sets used by the LFB have been mandated by the LFB, or would it come from the manufacturer or from tests?
The LFB could have procured higher powered intrinsically safe devices, but they may not then have been suitable for all of the environments that the LFB may have encountered. I have not been provided with the sort of analysis that would show what range they were planning for. However, I do notice that the Home Office, further down in my report, offers guidance on the level of intrinsic safety. It's not clear to me whether that was an explicit instruction to the LFB that 1 watt should be the highest levels of intrinsic safety or what would be suitable for the range of tasks facing the LFB. So in general terms, I can provide you with that general response, but the specific response as to what process the LFB went through in terms of determining whether 1 watt was appropriate for their operational needs is more complex. And I again think that there should be an evidence-based approach that justifies the level of intrinsic safety that they determine suitable for their breathing apparatus. At the moment, I believe that they are looking for a replacement which may be at a more medium level, quote unquote. And again, I would like to know if that maps across the range of operational requirements that they might clearly be anticipated to have. Otherwise, there may be a situation in which a high level of intrinsic safety is required, but the replacement sets don't meet that. Or equally, there may be no justified need for that medium level of intrinsic safety, and a more powerful, potentially, system could be used. So I think my feeling overall would be that it would be beneficial in the future to see the evidence base that justifies this decision, which does have an impact on communications, in my view.
Yes, I see. Does it follow?
Can we just look at the table, which is slipping off the bottom of our screens at the moment, which I think illustrates what Professor Johnson's really telling us. And would it be right to understand, just looking at this table, that if you were working in an environment in Group A, you'd want a very low wattage radio, and if you were working in an environment in Group G, you might be able to use a rather higher wattage radio?
Exactly.
And this gives us some indication of the sort of range of atmospheres that might have to be considered. Is that right?
And I think also relevant to this is that some fire and rescue services are not routinely providing intrinsically safe communication devices to their teams because they don't routinely encounter these sorts of environments. But we may come to that later on.
Yeah, just to finish the point off that the chairman has picked up, we can go over the page to page 43. Let's look together at 3.10 and 3.11, and indeed 3.12. Just taking all those together, there are, as we can see there, regulatory requirements published at European level and by the Home Office and the HSE about the use of UHF radios in particular areas. Yes?
Yes.
Now, just coming back to the answer you gave a moment ago, on what you've seen, can you conclude that it's the case that the LFB's approach was not to map, as you put it, particular radio strength or intrinsic safety to particular environments, but to use, as I might put it, a one-size-fits-all 1 watt approach?
Yes, and I think that may be justified at the time at which they made the procurement, but I think subsequently to that we can ask questions, especially from the basis of the Phase 1 report that's come out of the inquiry, whether or not that should be sustained into the future.
I see.
That's my feeling.
I see. We may come back to that.
Yeah.
In general, though, how would you expect an organisation deploying IS, intrinsically safe radios, to set its level of intrinsic safety? And I asked the question, as at or before June 2017.
I think it's a very difficult question to ask, in the sense that you're asking me to cast my mind back several years to that point. But if I had, ignoring the regulatory requirements above, if it had been my decision, I would have tried to base it in exactly the same way that I described, which to me, as a safety engineer, is a risk-based approach. However, I feel that the regulatory requirements in this case probably predominated more than anything else, rather than triggering a dialogue about what was an appropriate level of intrinsic safety for the operational needs of an FRS. Because I noticed, for instance, that in many cases breathing apparatus is used in an environment where, by definition, there will be a flammable environment, whereas in many cases for a fire and rescue service, the breathing apparatus is being used precisely because the flames are already present and the ignition source is already present. And so the justification for intrinsic safety in that situation is reduced, if that's clear.
Yes, and would it follow from that an organisation which didn't set its wattage to the fire in front of it, if I can put it very colloquially, was adopting a one-size-fits-all, and perhaps that would be inappropriate?
I think it's a complicated issue. I think in the sense that there is a precautionary approach. By setting a high level of intrinsic safety, you are safeguarding against a very wide range of environments, but then you need to take measures to mitigate the communication failures that have been seen in many previous incidents.
Yes. Now, if we go back a page, please, to 3.3.9, paragraph 3.3.9 on page 42. So I'm sorry, forward to page 44, paragraph 3.3.9, my mistake. And you say at the foot of the page there, most incidents in which Barry sets are used do not involve flammable or explosive atmospheres. Just focusing on a high-rise residential fire like the fire at Grenfell Tower, would there be any benefits to using an intrinsically safe radio?
I think that would have to be an operational decision made at the time, if there was a concern, for example, over gas build-up and other potential hazards within the environment. But this, in a sense, would ask me a question about what the policy would be if the Barry sets had a lower level of intrinsic safety than indeed they did on the night. But the converse part of this point is what I was saying before, which is that if you go for a high level of intrinsic safety, then I think you have an obligation to consider the communications problems that we've described as being a consequence of the lower power.
Yes. I can see that they're certainly interlinked, but
yes.
You say it's an operational decision. Does it follow from that in fact, where you've got no choice but to use a Barry set with 1 watt, no operational decision can be made because you haven't got anything else available?
Well, if we take a step back, the personal radios that were also provided on the night with the higher power that we described previously at the 4 watts were used extensively during the fire, and they should have been subject to a risk assessment prior to their use for the reasons that you suggest. But I have seen no evidence to suggest that a risk assessment of the sort that I advocated earlier was conducted. And so the point that you're making is a correct reflection of what was the case on the night of the fire, and not just a theoretical, abstract question to me.
Yes. And I think you say that there might have been an operational justification for using a 1 watt level of intrinsic safety because of the potential for the presence of other ignition sources such as gas.
I think so, but I think that part of the problem I have as I read the documents and the witness statements is that the lack of ability to communicate as you go further into a building provides no means then for you to communicate your experience. So somebody at a bridgehead, for example, making a decision that it's okay to use a 4 watt radio may lack the information about an explosive atmosphere further up the building. So even when I say that there's a lack of a systemic argument about the safety of the communications on the fire ground, I think as we go through today, we'll see many situations where you can see that there are gaps within existing policy, and that, you know, the policy says you should not use 4-watt radio until the risk assessment has been completed. But that risk assessment has to be based on knowledge of people who may be using a 1-watt set who can't communicate with you. And how do you ensure that you have a sufficient view to be able to do that risk assessment, leaving aside the fact that no risk assessment seems to have been done on the night of the fire?
Do you know whether it was possible at the time to procure radios that could be switched into IS mode, in and out of IS mode, which could protect firefighters in the initial stages of an incident while the scoping out occurred?
I have seen radios of that sort, but whether they would be suitable in this case, I can't answer.
Why might they not be?
I don't know whether there are any other. What, for example, we described that there may be several different levels of intrinsic safety, and I can't answer you that kind of 2-format radio would be sufficient to meet the highest levels of intrinsic safety without doing further checks.
Can we go to page 55 of your report, please, and look at paragraph 4.2.6? And you say there that the LFB's policy on the use of the Intel HT981 IS fireground radio states that higher-powered personal radios should only be used by BA teams where Barry sets are unavailable and after a risk assessment has been conducted by a senior officer to determine that it is safe to use non-IS communications. Can I take you to LFB's policy 458 on the use of handheld incident ground radio? That is at LFB 30.13039. And it's what you refer to at footnote 88, which has just gone from the screen, but has been replaced by this policy, which you can see reviewed as current as at 21st December 2015. And if we go to page 2 of that, please, and let's look at that page, 4th bullet down, under Intel HX480/81 incident ground radios, it says this: if dedicated Barry sets are not available, a minimum of a handheld radio must be carried. Intel 480/81 handheld radios are not intrinsically safe, IS, must not be used in flammable or explosive atmospheres, and should only be used where Barry sets are unavailable. The decision to use Intel 480/81 handheld radios can only be made following a risk assessment carried out at the incident. So just looking at that, is it right that it isn't in fact possible, according to LFB policy, for at least this policy, for an incident commander to decide that non-IS radios should be deployed in circumstances where Barry sets are available? For example, because they might provide better or stronger radio communication.
That would be my interpretation of that policy.
And if we go on the same page of your report, page 55, if we go back to that, please, and look at paragraph 4.2.7, you say there, during the Grenfell Tower fire and in some previous incidents discussed in this section, FRS personnel used their UHF handheld radios instead of their Barry sets, notwithstanding the fact that they'd not obtained approval from the IC, incident commander, and that the IC had not completed a risk assessment. Now, does that mean that when using their UHF radios in that way, those firefighters or other officers were exposed to the risk that intrinsically safe radios were designed to avoid?
Yes.
So an explosion, for example.
Yes. Can I just go back to a previous point that you made when you went to the LFB policy, which, as I said earlier on, it seems to have been the case. Well, it is the case that the intention was that in pairs of firefighters working with breathing apparatus, only one would potentially have a Barry set, would have the radio set. However, operational changes throughout the night meant that it wasn't always possible to ensure that these teams did have a Barry set. And so the point that you were making with the reference to the policy about the decision to use non-intrinsically safe radios if there was not a Barry set available could have or did occur on the night for some teams within the tower. although Barry sets were available to some people.
Now, if we go to page 45 of your report, please, you can see that at section 3.3.11, page 45, you pick up, there are 2 bullet points there. If you pick up the second one, 6th line down, this is a quotation from the LFB's post-Grenfell Tower fire review of its radio specification done in October 2019.
Yes.
And that suggests that BA teams were doing what they were doing because of, and you say this 4 lines up from the bottom of the bullet point, due to experience with the poor signal propagation of BA radios, confidence in the equipment is low, and therefore it is common practice for BA teams to enter smoke-filled environments, fires, with their non-IS 4W fireground radios on their tunics to improve communications. Now that's what the LFB say. Am I right that your opinion is that the prospect of an incident commander conducting a risk assessment in the way the policy contemplates is problematic?
Yes.
Yes, and is that because of your observation you make elsewhere that the LFB's policy doesn't explain how the outcome of a risk assessment can be conveyed to those who are already experiencing communications difficulties?
Exactly.
So in simple terms, would this be right, that individuals who've lost radio signal have got no way of being told that they were permitted to use their higher-powered handheld radios?
Exactly.
Now, if we go to page 55 again, please, and look at paragraph 4.2.8,
could I just add one very quick sentence to my previous answer,
yes.
which is as well, when you're using the UHF handheld radios, you may be on a different channel to those breathing apparatus colleagues. And so those colleagues that didn't receive the command that they could use their UHF radios will now not be able to communicate to those colleagues who are now using their handheld. And so, as I said before, there is a need to systematically analyse the reasons why all of these systems together provide an acceptably safe form of fireground communication.
Yes. Now, going to paragraph section 4.2.8 on this page, towards the bottom of your screen, you say the LFB's policy does not explain how the outcome of any risk assessment is to be conveyed to teams who are already experiencing communication failures, which would trigger the risk assessment in the first place. This illustrates the lack of a systematic approach to resilient communications. And what do you mean by the lack of a systemic approach to resilient communications?
Exactly what we've just been through in terms of rehearsing situations that don't seem to have been covered by the policy. And in particular, throughout my report, I'm concerned about how do you recover communications once they have been lost. And there's many reasons for that, but one is that the communication may have been lost for all of the reasons we described, but it may also have been lost because the firefighters were injured and in need of urgent assistance. The lack of communication doesn't always imply that the communication medium is down. It may mean that the firefighter has been overcome. And so part of my care in this evidence is to make it clear that this is a safety issue and not simply one about efficient firefighting, both for the residents and for the firefighters.
Yes. Now, can we go back to page 44 and look at paragraph 3.3.10? And this, I think, is your introduction to some of the LFB's own conclusions from the Grenfell Tower fire so far as communications are concerned. And you say this: other FRS have moved away from the use of IS radios because of the communications concerns associated with low-powered, higher-rated IS devices, and also because their BA teams routinely carry a range of other non-IS equipment. And you've got the passage we looked at. And if we look at that, in fact, a little bit lower down at page 45, you also say at paragraph 3.3.12, after the part I've read to you, this review also revisited the question of whether or not it's necessary for BA radios to meet IS requirements and recommended introducing a higher powered 4-watt IS specification for both BA and general fireground radios. you would go on to say, and I think to summarise this at 3.3.12 and 13, that the LFB's review of those matters resulted in the recommendation that the wattage of intrinsically safe radios generally be raised to 4 watts, while a stock of lower wattage intrinsically safe radios be retained for more hazardous environments. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Right, so the start of what you might have called the mapping exercise,
Yes.
based on evidence.
Yes. And I think that then there would be a need for appropriate policy to make the decision when they were to be deployed.
Yes. Now, this may sound like a rather simplistic question, but in your opinion, how likely would it have been on the night that an increase from 1 watt to 4 watts would have alleviated, if not resolved, the kinds of signal propagation problems experienced at the Grenfell Tower fire?
I think on the night of the fire, looking at the evidence, many of the firefighters resorted to using their personal radios anyway. But I think the problem then is the issue for those who remained, who are still using the breathing apparatus channel. And I think that the attempt to maintain both forms of communication may have eroded situation awareness as people desperately tried to form communication with their colleagues. And the other point that I would make here is not so much connected to power, but it's connected to the physiological demands on the firefighters. And so the 4-watt personal radios that were being used with breathing apparatus, if you could imagine that they are handheld and they're not connected to a microphone inside the helmet. And so the officers are trying to hold the radio while performing firefighting duties and rescue duties. And so the use of a 4-watt integrated radio within the breathing apparatus may have done some marginal improvement in terms of comparison with the handheld radios, the personal radios that they carried. But its integration into the breathing apparatus, I think, would have helped tremendously if that had been coupled with a concern for the usability issues that many of the firefighters suffered with the headsets anyway, which is also covered in the report.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to turn next to leaky feeders and radio repeaters. Can we start by your giving us, please, a layman's explanation of what that technology is and what it does?
So, as we described with duplex communication, you can use a repeater to receive the radio waves from a handheld set and then rebroadcast it to another handheld set, effectively extending the area of coverage. Now, what that does, as I described earlier, is it reduces signal localization. So if you've got more and more people who can now access that channel, and so you have to wait potentially for longer to get your chance to talk. So it extends the coverage but reduces the effect of signal localization, and that's a single repeater. Now, within a high rise, or if you imagine perhaps a better example would be inside a tunnel, the repeaters have to be placed at a certain distance apart, and then to boost the signal between those repeaters, you can run a cable that effectively leaks signals. And so anywhere along that cable, you'll get better reception, even if you're some distance away from the repeater. If you like, the repeater amplifies the signal and the cable carries it, and it leaks. Normally, the decision for all of these the pieces of equipment that we see around us here is to shield them so they don't interfere with things. But what a leaky feeder does is it transmits the communication so that anybody along the path of that cable will also be able to access it. That's the rough explanation. The obvious, as I said before, downside is that it reduces signal localization. More people have access to the communication channel, and it doesn't reduce the problem of congestion. So more people will be trying to talk on that same channel because they can access it further apart and distributed inside the building.
Yes, thank you. Now, can we go to page 182 of your report and look at paragraph 7.5? You set out there a lengthy quotation from the witness statement of the LFB's Dominic Ellis, who gives evidence there in his statement that certain radio channels, for example, channels 2 and 5, can only be used with a repeater. Now, I think it's right, isn't it, that those are UHF channels?
Yes.
Yes. And as we've seen, you've explained elsewhere on page 181 at paragraph 7.4.7, that is because the repeaters and leaky feeders enable the radios to transmit and receive half-duplex frequencies.
Yes.
And just so we're absolutely clear, is it right that the use of a half-duplex frequency doesn't alter the fact that only one party can transmit a radio message at any one time?
Yes.
Right. Now, is it right that where a leaky feeder is used to access a half-duplex channel, for example, where channel 5 is in operation, is that at the expense of a simplex channel like channel 6? Or can both channels operate simultaneously?
They can operate simultaneously, but the person who is setting their radio has to choose the channel that it's on, and so they'll be allocated to one channel, or they'll select one channel at a time. And so a big issue in terms of the processes that we've described earlier about deciding to go to a personal radio rather than a Barry set would be that you'd have to bring the others in your team with you, otherwise you would no longer be able to communicate with them.
Right, I see.
You would be on the wrong channel.
So you'd have to get the information to them somehow that they needed to change channels.
Yes.
Now, if we, building on that a little bit, go please to page 119 and 120 of your report. Starting at 119, we can see paragraph 5.8.5. I'd just like to show you the top of the screen first, if we do that, which is the selected communications architecture, which you get from policy number 466 in your figure 5.5.c on that page. And you can see at a glance how that works. It may be useful to come back to that in due course. But if you look at 5.8.5, you say this: PN 466 provides little guidance on the factors that should influence a decision to withdraw in the event of communications failures. And then if you go over to page 120, your excerpt, which you have quoted, ends with this: where a radio leaky feeder is in use, BA teams will be told to transmit on channel 5. Now, given that, would it follow that a channel transition is an operational decision by the incident commander rather than a necessary event?
Yes.
So it comes down to operational discretion.
Yes.
And in addition to facilitating half-duplex channels, is it possible for leaky feeders and radio repeaters to enhance the signal of simplex channels?
I'm not sure about that, but I am restricting my comments here to the policy and the technical information provided for the TSR 2000s and associated equipment that was used on the night of the fire.
Right.
And in that case, they're to be used with the duplex channels as indicated in the evidence that was provided by the witness.
I see. So you say that actually policy doesn't point you in the direction of using leaky feeders and radio repeaters to enhance the signal of simplex channels.
I would have to check on that, but it's certainly that's not discussed at any point in the information that I've had available to me.
Right. Now, thus far we've been looking...
So we understand your point, Mr. Millett. You're suggesting that the equipment could be used to receive a particular signal and retransmit that same signal, boost, if you like, that same signal. That's the point?
Yes, that's right.
Yes. Is that technically feasible, do you know?
I can't see any technical reason why, but I also feel that the benefits of half duplex in extending the range are the reason why you would use them. So I would really have to look into that. It's not something that arose during the preparation of my report, where I was focusing more on the operational policy as was used on the night of the fire, rather than what could technically have been done in other circumstances with that particular equipment.
Yes. I mean, the reason I ask the question is that it's
Yes.
not clear to us at the moment whether it's physically possible for leaky feeders and radio repeaters to work with simplex, or whether they only work ever with half duplex, or whether it's a matter of programming. Do you know?
I don't absolutely know, but my feeling is that the benefits rely on the use of duplex communication to extend the range, and my intuition is that trying to use them with simplex doesn't provide the operational benefits that they're intended to provide in the first place, but I would have to check that to be sure of my answer to you.
Now, Thank you. Yes, now, and that, thus far we've been exploring the use of leaky feeders combined with radio repeaters to enhance radio signals. And as you've highlighted in your report, I think it's right that leaky feeders can also be used in combination with telemetry repeaters to enhance telemetry signals.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Now, when it comes to the installation of leaky feeders and repeaters, you say in your report that they can either be fixed in buildings or tunnels.
Yes.
Or they can be portable to be deployed as needed at an incident.
Yes.
Or they can be permanently installed on LFB appliances, yes?
Yes.
And just for your reference purposes, this is all at section 7.2.7 on page 176. If we go to that page, let's follow on from that. If we go to that page, page 176, and look at paragraph 7.2.4, you say there that leaky feeders have a limited range and their propagation is typically only effective within line of sight of the cable.
Yes.
Well, does it follow from that if leaky feeders are deployed or were deployed in the enclosed stairwell of a high-rise building, such as that at Grenfell Tower, they may well not be effective in enhancing propagation of radio signals beyond the walls of the enclosed stairwell?
Yes. And I take from that again, I would strongly encourage some analysis if this technology was to be continued to be relied on in any way in the future, for studies to be done on realistic topographies of high-rise buildings to determine the extent to which your question is true. I think it is true, but I think there's a lack of empirical evidence to show exactly what that effect would be beyond the immediate stairwell.
So does that mean that it, as a matter of science, the use of a leaky feeder at Grenfell Tower may well have not enhanced propagation of radio signals into the communal lobbies or into flats?
And that's my feeling based on the evidence cited in my report from previous quote mixed unquote experience where they have been used in exercises such as Osiris, which is mentioned in, I think it was Russell Square Underground Station. But I've found it very hard to find any evidence of the successful deployment of leaky feeders in high-rise buildings.
And to what extent does the same limitation that we've been discussing apply to fixed radio repeaters?
I think that they offer more opportunity, and again, there's evidence for the use of those in, for example, the World Trade Center buildings, again cited in my report. And there was but they don't offer a universal solution. So, as is cited in my report, in one area in one of the towers they clearly were of significant benefit, but in another area there was some confusion as to whether the system had been activated or not. And so even though the system was activated, the fire personnel and police personnel assumed that it wasn't available.
Are there differences in signal strength between portable repeaters and fixed repeaters?
I would imagine that there would be in normal circumstances by the additional provision of mains electricity, but again, it may be that they would have comparable strength if the electrical supply was compromised, for instance, through terrorist damage or a fire.
Yes.
And I think, again, a systemic approach would really run some of these scenarios based on previous experience to determine the sufficiency of either fixed or mobile, because as was noted during 7/7, some of the fixed installations were damaged by the bombs, and so people still at that point would need mobile repeaters to achieve the same communications outcomes.
Yes, I understand. Does a repeater propagate a signal at the same strength it receives it?
It can amplify it and make it stronger.
Right. But it's not the case that a repeater would never propagate a signal at lower, or is it?
I can't envisage that, but there may be scenarios in which that could occur. But I think the key point about your argument again is that I feel that there was an insufficient risk assessment or evidence-based approach to actually work through some of the answers to those questions. So, as you said earlier on, I think there's a need for greater empirical experience I think there was a reliance on these devices but without a questioning attitude to the evidence that showed that they would be sufficient in the case of a significant large-scale incident.
Yes, I see. Are leaky feeders and radio repeaters intrinsically safe?
No,
They're not.
not as they were available on the night of the fire.
Right. So would that mean that the logic which impelled the LFB to use a 1-watt Barry set would also deflect them from using leaky feeders and radio repeaters?
Yes, it seems to me that some of the arguments associated with the deployment of leaky feeders and repeaters were not thought through in terms of intrinsic safety.
Right. So you would need to have, this is right, you would need also to have a risk assessment, some kind of risk assessment done by the incident command before deploying leaky feeders and radio repeaters.
And I feel that many of the personnel on duty on the night were unaware of some of these nuances. And the report, I deal with some of the training issues about the deployment that have subsequently been addressed, I believe, at least in part.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, I've got about 5 or 10 minutes more with this topic before changing to a completely new topic.
Well, would you rather finish the topic before we...
I would if that's convenient to you and to the witness.
Well, you don't mind going on a few minutes longer than usual, I'm sure.
No.
Right, thank you.
I'm going to park, if I may, the topic of UHF radios for the moment and come back to look at that later. But looking now at Airwave or main scheme, is it right that Airwave radio could be accessed either by a fixed radio fitted in LFB appliances or by using a handheld walkie-talkie type device?
Yes.
And is it right that Airwave radio was the way in which officers at the incident ground could communicate with control?
Yes.
And also with other emergency services?
Yes.
And that wasn't, I think, possible with UHF.
No.
No. Now, we've seen, I think, already, we've heard your explanation of the differences between digital and analogue. And then moving on then to some more detail, can we go to page 218 of your report, where you set out some evidence from phase 1 of the inquiry, at paragraph 8.9.1, under the heading Airwave coverage. And you say this: evidence in phase 1 of the inquiry indicated that Airwave provided better coverage than the UHF personal radios during the Grenfell Tower fire. And then there's some examination of a witness there, namely Brian O'Keefe, on day 19, which you footnoted over the page on page 450, at footnote 450. From a technical perspective, are you able to explain why that might have been the case?
Yes, I think it's an interesting set of questions. I think, again, there would be a need for a more evidence-based analysis. I'm drawing that on the witnesses' statements that many of them felt Airwave radio would have assisted what they were doing better than the UHF. But I also feel that argument may have been influenced by the fact that they didn't have the Airwave. And, had they had it, there's no guarantee that they would have achieved the effects that they anticipated. Airwave can work in two different ways. It can either work in direct mode or trunk mode. In direct mode, it operates very much like UHF. In other words, you're communicating in a walkie-talkie style to another handset. In trunk mode, you go through base stations, very much more like a cellular mobile phone, and communicate with an infrastructure that can then go through cables, depending on the architecture. And so, therefore, the ability to communicate outside of the area is better supported by Airwave than it would be by UHF, where you're effectively communicating within local groups on the scene, the fireground.
And do those benefits apply to any digital radio, or are they specific to Airwave?
As I mentioned before, the Airwave devices could have been used like the UHF radios in the walkie-talkie or direct mode, but they weren't purposed for that, for the operational use, at least at the time of the fire.
What I really mean is, are the benefits that you've identified attributable to the Airwave design per se, or would they apply to or be attributed to any digital radio?
They wouldn't necessarily be applicable to all digital radios unless they had that trunk mode which connected back to an infrastructure. It's the infrastructure that provides that out of fireground communication capacity.
Yes, I see. Now, we've looked already at the possible ways in which UHF radio signals might suffer from degradation or blockage. Do those concerns apply to Airwave radios?
Yes.
They do. do they apply to the same extent?
You can use greater degrees of signal processing on digital signals to recover the original message in the presence of interference, and so they, in general, tend to be slightly more resilient than analog UHF radios. However, I think it would be most people's experience with a digital radio at home that there comes a point when the total signal is lost. Whereas in UHF radio or analog radios, you can sometimes make out the signal even though it's extremely degraded.
Right.
So there's more of a, in my experience, more of a binary effect with digital radios than there is with analog.
Is it possible to enhance airwave signals using a radio repeater and leaky feeder technology in the same way that it is in some cases for UHF?
I would certainly believe so. I've not seen leaky feeders used with this sort of technology, but I certainly believe repeaters would work very well.
Yes. And can we go to please to page 208 of your report and look at paragraph 8.2.4 together? You say there, the benefits of digital radio include the ability to maximize bandwidth through the application of compression algorithms. Could you just explain very briefly, but in layman's terms if you can, what that means?
If you were to access a video over the internet, because of the amount of information that's required to communicate the image and the sound together, it's infeasible to transmit it in its raw representation of zeros or ones. And so algorithms are used to minimize the file size before it's sent across the internet. And the algorithms that do that increase the efficiency of digital communication. And so if you can, if you look at your television recently, you get 4K HD, and that's possible because new forms of compression algorithm enable more and more quantity of data to be transmitted on a relatively limited set of bandwidths. And the same could be done for voice and for video using digital communication on the fireground. So there's greater flexibility and greater ability to offer multimedia contents.
Right. And at paragraph 8.2.6 on the same page, just about 2/3 of the way down your screen, you say, the digital format of these communications means that they can be routed over wired IT networks as well as wireless infrastructures. Is that the same thing as bandwidth maximization?
It's more the case that there are possibilities to use digital communication with the internet and with those forms of infrastructures which are well established for other forms of communication.
I see.
And in the case of fireground communication into the future, we have to consider that the existing mobile telecommunications system and the existing infrastructure for wider forms of telecommunication offer possibilities as backups to dedicated emergency service network communications and so forth. So, and even within the LFB's mobile digital terminal plans and so forth, with the use of 4G and then 5G applications as a way of routing this information, which of course with UHF you're communicating through radio signals from handset to handset, rather than using the possibility of wired infrastructure that exists for other reasons.
Yes. Given that, well, let me ask you this. Is there a difference between broadband aggregation and the techniques that you've just been talking about?
I think broadband aggregation is one example. One
It's an
example of those wider possibilities.
Given that technology, and I think you've referred to Airwave 4G Max in your report,
Yeah.
as one of those to exploit signal strength
Yes.
from commercial operators. Given that relies on commercial mobile operators, what impact would that technology have on mobile phone users in the locality?
I think that's a really excellent point, and I think it's part of a much broader discussion both in the United Kingdom and globally about what we can and can't do. So for the chair, if we can use existing mobile infrastructure as a way of enhancing communication on the fireground, but as the question was suggesting, that would have an impact on, say, fire survival guidance calls made by the public, because any firefighter use of that infrastructure may limit the public's ability to access that. Within the UK, we have different schemes that enable privileged access by fire and rescue services to the digital telephone networks. But the consequences of the scheme that exists now is that it may turn off that system for the public, which would be appropriate potentially in a counter-terrorism case, but not necessarily or absolutely not in the case of a fire. There are other schemes operated in the United States, which are referenced in my report, that still provide public access, even though rescue services are given privileged access to that network. And to me, that is more flexible, except in the case of a counter-terrorism scenario, than the UK's priority access schemes for existing telephone systems.
Yes. Just finally, I think you explained earlier that UHF radios only permit one party to transmit at any one given time, and that others must wait for an opportunity to speak. Do Airwave radios operate in the same way or differently?
It's much more flexible in terms of digital uses of group communications, but I come back to the point that I made before, which is that although technically those kind of communications can be supported, they're operationally not desirable, because you may effectively talk over a colleague trying to relay an important message. And so radio discipline is as important in the operational use of Airwave or the use of an Airwave radio on the fireground as it would be for any other communication.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment for the break?
Yes, if that suits you, Mr. Millett, it is. Well, as you know, Professor Johnson, we have a break during the morning and the afternoon sessions, and we'll take our morning break now. We'll come back, please, at 20 to 12. And as with all the other witnesses, I have to ask you, please, not to talk about your evidence to anyone while you're out of the room. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. Would you go to the usher, then, please?
Thank you.
Thank you. 20 to 12.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Would you ask Professor Johnson to come back in, please? Okay. All right, Professor Johnson, ready
Yes,
to
thank
keep
you.
going? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Millett, when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Professor, I now want to turn to the challenges posed by the firefighting context in which was posed by the fire on the night, and start with congestion. First, in the context of radio communications, what do you mean by congestion?
Congestion for me occurs when, and as I've defined it in the report, occurs when people have important information to communicate, but the channel is already being used by somebody else, and therefore you have to delay your transmission in deference to the other person completing their transmission and not talking over them, as we've described.
Does it follow that in any large firefighting incident, questions, problems of congestion will arise?
I think it does, and I think that it should be anticipated.
And what practical impact does congestion have for radio users other than the obvious problems that you've identified already between speaker A and speaker B?
I think it's it introduces a myriad of problems beyond that need to be thought through carefully in terms of the policies and practices of the organisations that make the communication during an emergency. So a very specific example of when congestion becomes particularly acute is where we have the blind spots, if you like, that are referred to in the national guidance. And for example, the BA team can't communicate for a period of time, potentially finds out important information, whether it be about a flammable atmosphere or whether it be about residents that need further assistance. And because they can't communicate, when they reach a place where the communication is restored, for example, by getting closer to colleagues, they may be forced to wait, and they'll have an increased amount of information to communicate to try and re-establish the situation awareness of their colleagues. And so the problems of congestion and interference that we'll describe, I think, in a second, are exacerbated by the problems of lack of coverage.
Right.
And, you know, at the heart of it may be that really important information is delayed, waiting for less critical information to be communicated. And the other point I would make as well is that these problems are exacerbated if you do not know that your message is being received by the intended recipient, because you may then repeat your message to make absolutely sure that it's gone through, even though you don't have the confidence that it's been received because you can't hear them.
Right.
You may be interfering or congesting the airwaves for other people.
Now, in section 6.5, I don't think we need to turn it up, but it's at page 138 of your report. You've, I think, explored the phase 1 evidence, which tended to indicate that firefighters in the tower on the night were unable to transmit or hear anything on the UHF radios. I've summarised your own observations on the evidence. Is it possible for congestion to block signals in this way, or is that more likely to be the result of signal degradation or problems with radio propagation?
I think these are a spectrum of issues that occur simultaneously, and so, I mean, as I described it before, the point-to-point communication between Barry sets within a group, it's typically one person is able to talk at any one time, and so if that person is talking, you suffer from congestion because you have to wait for that person to finish unless you want to talk over them. Within the half duplex setup that we described for repeaters and leaky feeders, that would still be the case with one person talking at any one time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Now, can we go to page 46 of your report, please, and let's look together at section 3.5.4. You explained there that having different radio channels for different aspects of an operation can help reduce congestion. Again, it may sound like a simplistic question, but could you just explain, please, why that is?
As we saw in the previous diagram, the intended architecture would be to have for example, groups of co-workers using Barry sets in one particular area of the building and then communicating with a colleague who would then have their handheld, more powerful radio to communicate, for example, to the bridgehead. And there were other channels, such as channel 3, that could be allocated to other work groups, and that would not interfere with the BA channel. And that could be effective because the two groups are on different channels and therefore not interfering with each other because they can't hear each other while they work on potentially different tasks.
So in simple terms, channels are effective at reducing congestion because they reduce the number of people wanting to transmit on any given channel.
Yes.
And what would happen if somebody on one channel within one work group needed to communicate with somebody on another channel in a different work group?
Typically they would have to communicate with the coordinating officer, as I mentioned before, who might be using their UHF radio depending on the context, or they could change the channel of their radio, but then that would remove them from contact with their colleagues and introduce new forms of risk.
Right. So in theory, you might have, if you were a coordinator, you might have to have both an Airwave radio and a UHF radio.
I think, yes, I mean but I think in practice we're really talking about the UHF. They may have multiple UHF radios, one which would be a personal radio, and one that could be communicating with the people on the BA radio or on channel 3, for instance.
But you'd have to that coordinator would then have to switch.
They couldn't use, or they would have to change the channel on an individual radio.
Exactly. Yes, thank you. Now, if we go to the very foot of this page, please. You say at section 3.5.5, a list of the LFB's UHF channels and their uses is as follows. And you've set out at the foot of that page and onto page 47 the same list, I think, as in Dominic Ellis's witness statement, which is already familiar to the panel and to those who heard Gary Reason's evidence. We looked at it with him. If we just put that up briefly, if we just scroll down to page 47, and then on to page 48, we can see the channels that are listed there, which you've taken from the evidence. And then if we go then to page 49, there's the diagram, which we looked at earlier. And that's a slightly different diagram, but we can look at that. This is initial incident channel allocations, which I think is taken from policy 488, LFB's policy 488 on incident communications. Now, rather than listing the available channels out aloud, can I summarise them by reference to their usage, perhaps, and tell me if you disagree with anything I'm proposing? First, incident command. Is this right? That relied on channel 1, and you can see that from the pyramid base on the diagram, or channel 2 as a backup with repeaters.
Yes.
Yes. And then BA comms, that happened on channel 6, or as a backup channel 5, with the use of repeaters. And you can see that from the BA crews at the top of the diagram there, running into the burning house.
Yes.
Yes. Now, although it's not on this diagram, is it also right that there was a command unit for radio traffic which happened on channel 10?
I would have to check that. I don't have the notes with me at the moment.
Right. If we go to page 50 of your report, the next page, look at figure 3.3 on that page. This is channel 3 to reduce congestion on channels 5 and 6. This is the detail there. And I think we see there that channel 3 could be used for any other specific aspect or sector of an incident on the instruction of the incident commander or sector commander, as the case may be. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And I think later on in your report you say, and just for our notes, it's at page 149 at section 6.8.9, that channel 3 was at times used to relay FSG, fire survival guidance information, at the Grenfell Tower fire.
Yes.
It was. Now, you've explained already how the power of a handset bears on its signal strength and the practical implications that might have for radio users. And you've explained in your report, as we've seen, that some of the LFB's UHF channels also impose limitations on the power of radio transmissions. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, in the quotation that you've set out in your report, if we go to page 48, please, back 2 pages, you say, we can see it. It's not you, but it's the quotation there. That channel 1 is, if you go to 3.5.6 at the top of the page, channel 1 is the only 4 watt channel, and that most other channels operate at 2 watts, except channel 6, which operates at 1 watt.
Yes.
I'm summarising, but that's right, isn't it?
Yes.
What impact does a channel's transmitting power have on signal?
As argued previously, the higher the wattage in general, the greater the distance the signal will travel and the less signal localization there will be.
How does the transmitting power of a radio interact with the transmitting power of a channel, a radio channel?
I think that the channel is purely an allocation of frequencies, and so in general it shouldn't be, the power is determined more by the power of the handset rather than the channel itself, although there may be more detailed issues that arise with frequency propagation, but I don't think they're likely to be so important within this context.
I follow. So just to use an example, if a firefighter takes a handheld UHF radio operating at 4 watts and uses that to send a message on channel 6, which is operating at 1 watt, would that message be conveyed at 1 watt or at 4 watts?
I would believe it would be conveyed at 1 watt because that would be preset, but I'm not 100% sure. I think it would depend also on the devices that were being used.
Right.
Well, sorry, I'd just like to understand that, please.
Yeah.
The proposition is that the radio operating at 4 watts transmits a message which is received, albeit on channel 6, by a receiving station that is operating at 1 watt. I would have assumed, but I don't know much about this, as you probably realise, that the signal would be sent at 4 watts strength and would be picked up by anyone within range of the 4 watt signal.
I think that it would be useful to have clarification of this from somebody within London Fire Brigade who understands how the handsets operate. But my belief, based on what I see in front of me, is that the personal handheld radios operated routinely on all the channels at 4 watts, and the BA equipment operated on the channel it was used at 1 watt. So I would be interested to know how the handsets attenuated the signal. So in other words, it may well be that the handsets were designed to operate at a lower wattage when assigned to those channels, but I haven't seen any technical information on that to this point.
All right, but are we right in understanding, am I right in understanding that when we talk about the wattage, we're talking about the transmitting power?
Yes. Yes.
Nothing to do with the receiver at all?
No, nothing to do with the receiver.
Exactly.
And similarly, nothing to do with the channel, because the channel is simply a channel. It's a method of allocating frequencies, and doesn't determine power of transmission.
From this quote, it looks to me as though the equipment is set so that the power of the transmission is reduced if it's set to a particular channel. But as I said before, this is the only quote that I've seen that makes that point.
Well, that's why I asked the question, because it rather suggests that the channel has a transmitting power. And you say that's not the case.
No, I think that would be set within the device that would then transmit a lower power if it was using those channels.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry to intervene again, but again, I had understood that when we use the word channel, we are actually just using a shorthand for frequency.
Yes.
And each of these channels is a transmission at a different frequency.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Well, then help me. When it says there is considerably lower power on channel 6, this is a quotation from Mr. Ellis's witness statement, but he's, I think, quoting from what he understands to be the Home Office regulation. When he says there is considerably lower power on channel 6, the BA channel, what does that mean?
I think this quotation needs further analysis. I'm not comfortable in the sense that I personally, up until this point, believed that the channels that were operating, in other words, that the devices were set at a particular wattage, and that the handheld radios operated on 4 watts irrespective of the channel. However, that this quotation seems to be inconsistent with that belief, and that it may be that the handheld radios that were capable of operating at 4 watts were in some way reduced to 2 watts if a particular channel was selected. I haven't seen that in any of the guidance, apart from this quotation. Coming back to your point about the channel 6 and the BA, I mean, that's simply to say that it's not the channel that's at that wattage. It's the devices that operate on that frequency are only transmitting at 1 watt, as we've suggested previously.
Yes. I mean, standing back and using your expertise as an information technology scientist, does it make sense to say that Channel 6 has any power, lower or higher than anything else?
Not to me.
No. Now, would it follow from that in fact, what is happening, as you've seen it, is that there are different channels signifying different frequencies, and the LFB have made a decision as to what handsets or BA sets with different wattages will be allocated to each.
Exactly.
Thank you. Now, yes, but the same problem may be identified elsewhere. Perhaps you can help us with this. Can we go, please, to Mr. Ellis's statement to the police? This is at MET 000773839 at page 9, and let's look at the second paragraph down. In light of what you've just told us, I just want to put this to you. He says in that second paragraph the reasons why the channels other than 1 and 6 are 2 watt are somewhat difficult to explain. This was the transmitting power of the channels of the Maxon radio, HX480/1's predecessor, and it is assumed that this was due to battery power, as the higher the wattage, the greater the draw on the battery. The reasons that the HX480/81 used the same power outputs even though the batteries had improved was probably because it was not considered at the time that a greater output was required. However, LFB personnel who worked in this area have since retired, as this was 12 years ago. Now, firstly, are you able to help us with whether the LFB would have been able to change the wattage of its channels, as is suggested there?
I come back to the explanation offered by the chair, which is my view too, that the channels are simply allocations of frequency, and that and as you suggested yourself, that the LFB made a decision of what power of devices would be available to transmit on those particular channels.
Yes.
And that they're saying here that the decision to use a 2 watts on those particular channels is for historical reasons, based on the amount of battery power that would otherwise have been needed to increase the wattage.
Yes. So it makes no sense to speak
sense.
of transmitting power of the channels.
No, not to me.
Of the radio, no.
Not to me.
Now, if we then go, please, to page 48 of your report and look at paragraph 3.5.8. You can see there that you say the LFB had access, underlined, to channels 4, 7 and 8 at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire. However, they had not made it their practice to use these channels for additional capacity at the time of the fire. And if we go on to 3.5.9, it says this: opportunities were missed to increase the capacity and resilience of fireground communications through the use of these channels, which are now being used, in particular channels 4 and 7, and then you quote from Mr. Ellis's statement again. Could you explain to us briefly why you've reached that view? Opportunities were missed.
Well, if we take channel 7 that was used for interoperability with the police, for example, they had just made the move operationally to Airwave and weren't using UHF in the same way that they had been, and so channel 7 was effectively vacant at that point because of the MPS use of Airwave, and it had been freed for FRS use. But as argued previously, well, I think there's a bigger context to all of this discussion. If we look at the Lacanau House fire and the coroner's decision or coroner's recommendation that additional channels may have helped in reducing congestion, which is the context to this, the statement I then make that additional channels may have helped reduce congestion is based on that argument from the coroner. However, later in the report, I also make the balancing point that, as I've said before today, that any change in channel, for example, where we were discussing channel 3, which is used in an ad hoc way sometimes for working groups, and that people moving to that channel would then no longer hear things on the other channels that they had previously been on. And so there are opportunities to have reduced congestion in the same way that the coroner had advised or recommended be considered in the aftermath of the previous tragedy. But then that would have created a greater need for coordination and coherency of communication on the fire ground.
Yes. So can we summarise it that by using additional radio channels in addition to those which were used, that might have had an adverse impact on the communications in the absence of somebody who was able to coordinate and command?
I think an early decision should have been made to appoint a communications officer who would have been able to, supported by appropriate policy and pre-incident training, who would have been able to coordinate some of these decisions.
Yes, I see.
Now,
Gary Reason, Assistant Commissioner Reason, told the inquiry that he thought Channel 4, one of those three that you've identified, was not used in this way because of the potential for interference with Channel 6, the BA channel, the default BA channel, and suggested that was a feature of the radio spectrum which was set by a government department, and therefore something which the LFB could not overcome or mitigate in any way. Is that right?
I think it's entirely plausible, and I've seen that evidence. However, I think that if viewed in the light of what we know subsequently, which of course makes it difficult to know the force of the argument, I think if people had gone back to the Home Office and made this point, then the channels could have been reallocated in a more in a better way to maximise the potential for the use of the different frequencies. But from this perspective, it's very difficult for me to without doing more empirical tests to actually know whether that assertion is true or not. It's believable, very believable that you could have that kind of interference because two channels are in adjacent frequency spectrum.
Right. I mean, are you aware of any ways of overcoming or mitigating that interference?
By reallocating the channels so that they could be used. I think that while that might be true, for example, of Channel 4, then it may not also be true of Channel 7 and 8. So the general point, I think, still holds that channels could have been used in different ways to support the operational requirements on the night of the fire. But again, a proper safety assessment and a consideration of the transition between channels at key points in the fire and the coordination of that and communication of that, I think, is essential. And I struggle in the existing evidence that I've seen to really know how that process was coordinated.
Yes.
Which is why I think the firefighters felt so unconnected, if you like, from other people in terms of the communication they received.
You say at paragraph 3.5.7 on the screen in front of you that proposals had been made within the LFB to consider a distinct channel dedicated for communications during high-rise incidents, and you cite from the draft LFB PowerPoint at LFB 000030171 from December 2014, you which wasn't actioned, I should add, and others may recall, in fact, a PowerPoint which described this new channel, which was explored in his evidence with Mr. Reason, and he said that he hadn't been made aware of that idea. Staying with the topic of additional radio channels, you then, I think, go on to say at page 77, if we look at section 4.13.1 there, under the heading Congestion and Channel Allocation, the coroner, that's the Lacknell House coroner, the coroner was concerned that some of the communications problems experienced by the Barry crews were due to congestion, which might have been reduced by the provision of additional channels. Her Rule 43 letter therefore made the following recommendation to the LFB, and you set it out there. You then, I think, go on at page 79 to set out the LFB's response to the coroner at paragraph 4.13.10, and over to page 80, which is where one finds it. If we go back to page 79, you can see the LFB's most recent position on this issue. The section, it's a long passage, and it starts, at present the brigade has the capability to use multiple radio channels. If you pick it up at the third paragraph down in that, it says the use of since the Lacknell House fire, the brigade has introduced a BA telemetry capability, which was reduced the amount of BA radio communication which was required at incidents. This has been achieved through the use of new BA entry control boards, which allow for a greater degree of automated monitoring and supervision of BA wearers, with the result that entry control officers no longer need to check gauge readings with wearers by radio. This new technology has therefore further increased capacity when using a single BA radio channel and reduced the risk of congestion. In summary, having carefully considered the recommendation, the brigade is firmly of the view that the risks associated with using more than one BA channel during an incident would outweigh the benefits that this operational practice would afford. What is your understanding of the risks associated to crews, BA or otherwise, of using more than one radio channel at a significant incident?
Well, I think we've rehearsed them, and it's already, in a sense, in the policy because of the possibility of moving to UHF communication if BA sets were unavailable. And as I said before, some of the crews went in without not BA sets, Barry sets, and some of the crews went in without Barry sets. So in that case, you would automatically be changing channel,
yes,
as I understand it. I've been careful in the report not to try and present a panacea to these issues, but to try and point out where I think the complexities and contradictions lie in the existing policy. And I think that the coroner's point, which possibly wasn't addressed here, is that there is an issue of scale, in the sense that having a single channel for BA communication makes perfect sense while the number of people trying to use that channel is below a threshold. But once it exceeds that threshold and those people are in a relatively confined space, the channel can become ineffective because so many people are trying to use a scarce resource. And also, as is frequent in the evidence that's been presented to the inquiry, there's a tendency to rely on congestion rather than power and coverage.
Yes.
And I feel that, again, as I mentioned before, if these lower powered radio systems lack coverage, then there's immediately a communications overhead when people try to come back into contact and relay all of the information that they've received. So I understand and I value the argument that's made here, but there's a level of detail and complexity below it that I think needs to be explored in order to convince me that it's safe in general for large-scale high-rise fires.
Now, what I read to you was the brigade's response to the coroner's recommendations. If we go to page 80 and look at 4.13.10, you say many of these same arguments about congestion have been reiterated in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire. And then you can see in the second paragraph there, you pick up the recommendation made by the coroner, a consideration of, in the second line, whether it would be beneficial to consider the use of additional BA and personal radio channels at major incidents. And then it goes on to say, the brigade concluded at that time that the risks associated with using more than one BA radio channel during an incident would outweigh the benefits that this operational practice would afford, and maintains a similar position at this time. And you'll see footnote 155 links down, if we can just scroll down please on page 80 to the bottom of the page, to footnote 155, LFB Grenfell Tower Improvement Progress Report at LFB 00067784. So that's the brigade's position post-Grenfell. That conclusion is the LFB's position post-Grenfell, as well as pre-Grenfell, as we now see. What are your views about that?
I think that there is a greater need, as I said this morning, to go back and start examining from first principles the extent and reliability of radio coverage, UHF radio coverage in high-rise buildings. I understand many of the arguments that have been made are valid, but they don't address all of the complexities that arise in operational incidents. And in particular, I think the previous incidents that I've noted in my report, going back through 7/7, 9/11, the King's Cross, etc., where there's a huge amount of information has been gathered. These scenarios should be used to test these arguments. And I think, again, that some of the questions that were asked to me about the construction of the buildings or the meteorological effects on the propagation of radio signals are areas that need to be researched. I mean, not just for the sake of research, but if people are to make an argument that this is a valid way of maintaining the safety of building occupants and the fire services, then I think it needs to be based on evidence rather than on assertion, which often it seems to me that that's really what's being used here.
Given what you have seen in the evidence about the experience of communications on the fireground on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire, do you consider that the conclusion that the LFB is maintaining a similar position at this time as cited here is justified?
I would certainly. My feeling is that it's not backed by sufficient evidence, and that I would question it as a continued stance for an operation in the future that had the same characteristics as Grenfell. It may indeed be justified, but I would like operational evidence and evidence from drills and scientific experiments to give me any confidence that could be upheld. I mean, I think what's really important to me is that we've got two counter-examples in terms of what happened in Lakenhall Hall and what happened in Grenfell. And so in order for this, I accept what they're saying, but I would like to know what evidence they would base that on.
So by counter-examples, do you mean cases which would challenge the conclusion stated there?
Yes, I mean, I think in both cases it's clear that the channels became congested, and I have said that I've set out, if you like, what I believe the reasons for that to be, partly to do with low power, partly to do with the building construction, but also to do, and as acknowledged by LFB, the number of firefighters deployed. But that's I believe that we could conceive of many future incidents, hopefully not, but future incidents in which similar problems might arise, and we need a solution. To simply say that people should be more disciplined in their use of a radio, to me, is not sufficient or not something that I would want people to place their lives on. That's how I feel about it.
Can I ask you to go back a page, please, to page 79? Let's look at a very slightly earlier passage at section 4.13.9. And you say the response ignored the fact that both channels 5 and 6 were intended to support BA crews, depending on whether leaky feeders and radio repeaters were deployed, and that firefighters might be using both at the same time if the transition were not coordinated. And then there's the passage I've read, or part of which I've read to you. Can I just ask you to explain what you mean when you say that the LFB's response ignored the potential use of channels 5 and 6 to support BA crews?
I think it's a refinement of the point that we made earlier on, which is that if you deploy these additional pieces of equipment to extend the range of the signals, and people don't know that that's happened, then especially because the reason you deployed them was that people were not communicating, how would they know then to transition to the new channel? They would effectively be isolated, and when they did come back into range, of their colleagues would not be able to communicate with them. So it's again, it's this issue of trying to work through the nuances that persuade me and other people that these are safe procedures.
Yes. And on the question of nuances, let's just pick this up at page 150 of your report, section 6.8.12, 150, where you say there, in order to move channel, there must be an initial approval from the commanding officer and then coordination through the designated communications officer. Otherwise, some team members will not be made aware of the channel change and will therefore become isolated. Does that mean that, in a nutshell, unless firefighters are told about the move, they may find themselves without any communications?
Yes.
Yes. Now let's look then at LFB's policy 488 on incident communications. It's at LFB 50736. We saw it referred to in one of the diagrams. There it is, reviewed as current 25th of May 2016. If we can go please to page 3, halfway down the page, you can see that section 5 of this policy covers channel 3. And if you look at 5.5, it says, ensure that crews are aware that they must return to channel 1 following completion of the task. Now, it says that in relation to that channel. It doesn't seem to be an instruction which is general, looking at this policy. To what extent, if at all, would that type of instruction alleviate your concerns about possible firefighter isolation?
Not at all. I think the very trivial example would be when there's a task completed, and how do you communicate that? I think the other examples that I've cited of previous fires have illustrated the very real confusion that arises. For example, there was one of the Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service reported where firefighters' fatalities were sustained because the channels weren't adequately agreed at the start of the incident. But I mean, here is another complexity in terms of coordinating. Right. I think under operational circumstances, it might be very difficult to ensure that people did that at the same time and went back. But I think there is a general problem, I think, which is how would you respond when you feel that communications have failed? How do you re-establish communication, not just with individuals but across the fire ground?
And are you aware of any other ways in which the risk of isolation by moving channels could be mitigated?
I think there's again, I've tried in the report to avoid saying this is how it could be solved, but to point out that there is a need for a more sustained view and a sustained argument about why existing provision or any future provision is safe, and by exposing it to these arguments, which are based on real experience, for example, with Grenfell Tower, to really see how these scenarios would be dealt with in detail in the recovery from a loss of communication. There are plenty of ways in which we could hypothesize that these things could be dealt with, but they also need to retain a view of the digital fireground in the future, because I think many of the problems that arose here could be solved with new forms of technology that are being experimented with in other parts of the world. Part of the problem here would be, by relying on voice communication, if you miss that voice communication, you automatically use available bandwidth and saying, what did you say? What channel are we on? To kind of reconfirm that previous thing. And I think some of this information would be better using data or a text-based system or something like that, where people could get that information without building up the communication channel. In other words, voice communication is extremely inefficient at doing something like this.
Is there any role for radio operators in manually relaying messages across radio channels? I say, was there on the night?
As far as I'm aware, individual officers played that role, but in a less formal role, in a way it was just purely fulfilling the operational duties that they had based on the diagrams that you saw previously. But there are numerous examples of people repeating questions multiple times, 5 or 6 times, and not getting a reply, or not knowing whether or not they've been heard at all.
Now, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about congestion, comparing UHF on the one hand with Airwave on the other. Can we look, please, at page 219 of your report at section 8.10? You say, congestion remained a concern with Airwave as the heading, and then the subheading at 8.10.1, congestion was still an issue for Airwave users on the night of the fire. And if you go, well, as a preliminary question, when it comes to the question of radio capacity and the problem about congestion, is there any difference between a UHF radio and a digital airwave radio?
As I mentioned before, UHF in the Simplex or peer-to-peer form between two handsets is highly constrained to one person communicating at any one time that you can hear on that channel. With Airwave, those limitations are not there, but there are other forms of limitation, which is that the infrastructure that communicates the airwave signals has a capacity. And so if large numbers of people are communicating over a wide range of talk groups, at some point that capacity is exceeded, just because the infrastructure can't cope with it. A bit like trying to get a mobile telephone message on New Year's Eve at midnight. Everyone, I think, has experienced that kind of delay where the infrastructure is overloaded. And even with more advanced architectures, that's likely to be the case in something like Grenfell Tower, because so many people want to use the existing communications infrastructure. In the case of Airwave, with more dedicated systems, that's not competing for public use, but some of the issues of 4G and 5G I've mentioned before in that respect. The other thing I would say as well is that there is a role for radio discipline in this, and as I've said later on in the report, I think some of the airwave issues may simply have arisen because a small number of people were responsible for receiving the messages, and maybe it would have been communicating with others at the time at which people were trying to communicate with them. So,
and as you say in your report at 8.10.2 on page 220, I don't think there's a need to go to it, but you say airwave talk groups would be capable of addressing the problem of congestion adequately.
Yes.
Could you just explain very briefly why you've come to that view?
Well, talk groups are analogous to channels in the sense it with Airwave, and but much larger numbers can be set up because it's a digital medium. And part of the hesitancy for London Fire Brigade using Airwave in an operational context is that what they don't know, that they question whether it would be efficient or reliable to set up a large number of talk groups on the scene of an incident to support all the different communication needs. Whereas with UHF, you have a very relatively small number of well-known channels, and people should agree and understand on what they are. The flexibility of Airwave, if you like, gives them more pause for thought. Would people create airwaves in an ad hoc way? And I understand that argument, but I also would point to the Metropolitan Police Service and the London Ambulance Service use of Airwave. And in the report, I mentioned they have significant operational experience of setting up these talk groups to manage operational incidents. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Yes. Let's then look next at the impact of high-rise building materials on communications. We'll come back to the use of Airwave later. Can we go, please, first to page 56 of your report at section 4.3. And there you set out national guidance and reviews and some extracts from that at the time of the fire, which I think confirm that high-rise incidents may give rise to communications difficulties. Yes?
Yes.
So this was a known, as it were.
Yes.
Yes. Looking at GRA 3.2, which you've set out at section 4.3.2 of your report, in brief there, you can see that it says, high-rise incidents may create difficulties with lines of communication and radio reception. The scene of operations may be a considerable distance from the access level and point of command. Building construction may cause radio reception blind spots and affect radio-based breathing apparatus telemetry systems. Now, if we go to paragraph well, let's go to a document. LFB 00110654. We'll come back to the report in just a moment, but I just want to show you an email internally within the LFB in February 2013. It's from Jim Acourt to Tim Cutbill of the 28th of February 2013, which we've seen with other witnesses, particularly with AC Gary Reason. And if you look at the third bullet point down there, it says this: totally unobstructed, LFB incident ground radios will transmit and receive clearly over a distance of more than 500 metres. First, do you have any view about whether that statement is accurate or not?
It seems very plausible to me.
So, in theory, is it right that UHF signals would be capable of travelling up a number of floors in a high-rise block?
That's a different question.
So, let's break it up. But the distance of 500 metres, which I think you said is reasonable, would that be horizontal or could it be vertical?
It could be vertical, but the question is totally unobstructed. The caveat.
Yes, I see. In the looking at Lakenal House, which is of course the context in which this email was generated, as you can see from the first paragraph, the weasel words there, or the key words perhaps, are totally unobstructed. In fact, I think you're saying that would never be the case with a high-rise building where you're seeking to transmit vertically.
Yeah.
Yes. Now let's go then back to your report at section 6.6.4 on page 142. Page 142, and you say there, the Barry communication system was, in my view, never designed to support incidents within a high-rise building where many users were in close proximity to each other and were some distance away from the bridgehead / BA communications operator. See figure 5.5C in the previous section of my report, which we looked at, which provides an indication of the LFB's intended scale of Barry usage. Now, you mentioned the distance from the bridgehead there. How did that specifically influence the conclusion that you've reached?
I think that obviously within that point there are two issues. One is the issue of congestion, as we've described previously, just the large numbers of people trying to communicate on the same channel, and then the building material, as you alluded to, creates problems of attenuation and signal loss, which, combined with the lower powered signal strength of the Barry sets, I think, to me it's a situation where I think the arguments that have been made, for example, in the coroner's court after Lakenal, about the use of repeaters and leaky feeders, I think those arguments are made in recognition of this argument, which is that the longer the distance is between the bridgehead and the BA crews, the more likely it is that communication will fail. And
that's because of a combination of distance as a result of low wattage.
Yes.
And obstruction.
Yes.
Before you even consider congestion.
Yes, and the impact of things like fire and any firefighting activities that generate large amounts of vapour, for instance, that we've mentioned before, will attenuate the signal.
Yes. Now, in stating your conclusion here, you've referred to paragraph figure 5.5C, which I think we saw earlier. Let's just go back to that, if we may. It's at page 119 of your report.
Before we do, can I just clarify one thing? Do you remember a little earlier you were asked about the figure of 500 metres, totally unobstructed, for the range of what was described as an incident ground radio? Are we talking there about the handheld radios transmitting at 4 watts?
That's my interpretation of that statement, yes.
Right. Do you have any idea of the range of a Barry set transmitting at 1 watt?
This is part of the need for empirical evidence, and if we come back as well to a series of questions that were made earlier this morning about battery power, I think that's germane here too. Mm-hmm. So while a transmission may be received at one point in the incident, is that sustained through prolonged use, for example?
Well, that I can see, but how about the range of the one what Barry said?
I would anticipate it's significantly lower than the 500 metres, but I again, would really welcome more empirical work on that, and I haven't seen that level of detail in the evidence presented so far to me.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Millett, but it seemed to me a relevant question if we're talking about radios being used within the building.
Yes.
Where some were Barry and some were not.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Indeed.
Can I just comment on that as well? Because very often what I see coming out, not just from this incident but from other incidents, is a blank or a bold statement that the equipment functioned as intended, and that to me doesn't give me that kind of level of granularity. So when I say there needs to be better standards of investigation of incidents of this sort, I think those answers should be asked for. I think they're really important.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we then look, in light of that, particularly at figure 5.5.c, which you've referred to in paragraph 6.6.4 there on page 142, and 5.5.c is at page 119. We looked at it before, briefly, and you've entitled it Selected Communications Architectures from PN 466, which we looked at also.
Yeah.
And you say that it provides little guidance on the factors that should influence a decision to withdraw in the event of communications failures. But what I want to ask you about is this. What is it about that diagram that led you to the conclusion that Barry sets were not designed for high-rise incidents like Grenfell Tower?
I think there's an assumption that the communications with the communication operators will be reliable. And certainly the witness statements make it clear that many of the firefighters felt that those communication infrastructures were no longer sustained, and therefore the information that the firefighters tried to relay as they went deeper into the tower no longer went back to the operations commander. And then by a consequence of that, I think it was very difficult for the operations commander and for other key decision makers to retain a fully accurate position as to what was going on inside the tower.
Is that because there are too many people?
I think the scale, part of what you were commenting to, I think in the previous paragraph of my report, is that it would be a useful exercise to compare this with what actually was the scene and the scale of people involved during the night of the incident.
Yeah. Yes. Now, can we go back to page 56 of your report, which we were looking at before, in the context of the contents of GRA 3.2, and we looked at where it says, as you've quoted, that building construction may cause radio reception blind spots and affect radio-based breathing apparatus telemetry systems. You see that?
Yeah.
With that in mind, can we then turn to page 80 of your report and look at section 4.14, which is where we find your discussion of the role of construction materials in more detail, with particular reference to reports produced by the LFB following the Lacknell House fire. And if we look at page 81 specifically, paragraph 4.14.3, there's a long quotation there from Appendix 63, which is the Lacknell Report Operational Response of the LFB, which is at LFB 3041759. And if you look at the third paragraph of that, which is the one below the bullet points, which starts when propagating radio waves. If you look at the fifth line down, it says this: buildings which have a significant thickness, of concrete or large amounts of metal used in their construction may significantly attenuate the signal. Concrete floors within buildings are often poured onto a metal pan, which can completely block most radio signals. Some solid foam insulation and some fiberglass insulation materials used in a building's exterior walls have foil backing, which will reduce signals further. Energy-efficient windows and metal window screens also form very effective barriers to radio signals. Now, first, do you agree or do you disagree with what I've read out to you there?
Definitely agree.
You agree. Are you aware of any other building materials which can impact or have an adverse effect on radio signals and their propagation?
Exterior cladding?
Exterior cladding. That's quite a broad
yes, as I understand. I'm not an expert on exterior cladding, but
right,
I have seen
with that.
I have seen it mentioned in reports previously that has been a factor in radio propagation. I can't tell you anything about the actual radio characteristics of of what was involved in Grenfell, but those that involve metal composites, for example, are often identified as affecting radio signals.
Involving metal.
Well, metal involved in their construction.
So would that be the metal fixings and perhaps an aluminium rain or other metal rain screen outer skin?
The kind of comments that I've seen have been pre-Grenfell and in this kind of level of detail. So, but again, I add that to my list of concerns about the measurement or pre-site inspections for radio signals within high-rise buildings. I think there are many individual variables that could contribute to an accurate assessment of the risk to communication created by the structure of the building.
When you say pre-site inspections, do you mean gathering of information under Section 7.2D of the FRA 2004?
Yeah.
You do. Now, this report, as you can see, mentions a
could I just pick up on that point, because I think it's important. I don't think that should every inspection should involve that, but certainly over a particular height or occupancy, or if a building was regarded as a high risk prima facie, then I don't think it would be disproportionate to ask more detailed questions that might affect communication. If that, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just feel that's an important point.
No, thank you. Absolutely. Looking back at the text here, you can see that there's a reference to significant thickness or large amounts of these materials. Does it follow, to the best of your understanding, doing the best you can with this text, that the thicker the layer of the material, the more likely it will obstruct or degrade a radio signal?
I think, as I mentioned before with 7.2D, I think that there is a need to base 7.2D on some empirical evidence about this. Again, I think it's such an important issue, and there's evidence of communication failures in so many large incidents previously that have not been collected consistently into a single corpus, if you like, that people could say this is a major problem because it was at Lackenhall House, it was in Shirley Towers, it was in so many previous instances, that it deserves an empirical basis on which to answer your question. My opinion is that it would be.
And when you say empirical evidence, do I take it that you mean tests on materials taken both alone and in coordination with other materials making up, for example, a cladding system?
Yes, and also with the sensitivity to the construction techniques used by different buildings, because with the estate, even within a mile of here, we'll see many different types of building with many different internal properties that would affect radio propagation. And I think, given that many of those buildings also have ORD entries that we maybe discuss later on, I think that for some of them that pose high risk, it would be appropriate to do more detailed on-site testing to provide evidence of assertions about radio communications issues, especially if intrinsically safe devices are to continue to be used.
And would it follow, in general terms, that an accumulation of materials, for example, a number of concrete floors, perhaps with a metal pan or with rebar, would also have an increasing impact on signal propagation?
Yes.
Yes. Now, let's look at the role of those problems we've identified thus far at Grenfell itself and the post-fire testing of those communication systems. Can we go, please, to page 141 of your report to start with? And let's look together at section 6.6.1. And your conclusion, I think, there is that the communications problems experienced by the BA teams were caused by systemic interactions between, and you set out three things. One, signal localization from lower powered IS radios. Two, the problems of limited signal propagation in high-rise concrete buildings as the teams moved to the upper floors and further away from entry control. And three, congestion / interference between large numbers of firefighters in close proximity. Now, looking at that, would I be right to think that it's also your view that the LFB has incorrectly attributed the problems experienced on the night of the fire solely or almost solely to congestion?
Yes.
Yes. And if we go to page 160 of your report, please, at section 6.14, you can see under the heading Radio Communications Tests in Grenfell Tower, post-incident tests in Grenfell Tower appear to have caused the LFB to focus on congestion stroke interference rather than the limited power of the IS Barry sets. And there's a text set out there. If you look at the last paragraph in the text, which is taken from the LFB Grenfell Tower Improvement Progress Report, page 38, as you can see from footnote 331, which is not on your screen, but don't worry about that. It says, the brigade has conducted testing at Grenfell Tower since the fire, which indicated that BA communications issues were predominantly caused by the volume of radio traffic, but accepts that the tests confirmed some very limited signal propagation issues associated with channel 6 used for BA communications. Now, I think you've examined, haven't you, the methodology behind those tests?
Yes.
And you've examined their results too, haven't you? And you've set out those results in 2 tables in your report. Let's look at the first of those. It's on page 161, if we turn the page, at table 6.1, as we can see there. Am I right in thinking that's the testing of the incident command UHF channels 1 and 2?
Yes.
Yes. And if we look at the table, we can see from the top row that you've set out the test number, condition, which I think is the nature of the test conducted.
Yes.
Yes. And then the result, which, as I understand it, is taken directly from the LFB's documentation in each case.
Yes.
Now let's look at each row in turn. First, which is the first row of the table, channel 1, that was tested within the inner cordon and atrium of Grenfell Tower, and the messages were found to be, quotes, clearly audible without signal loss, as we can see.
Yes.
And if you look at the second row, as for messages sent on channel 1 from a radio placed in the same location as the first command unit, CU8, and received by other radios within the inner cordon and atrium of Grenfell Tower, those communications were described as possible. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Just pausing there, were you able to infer anything about the quality of the radio communication from what you saw of these tests?
No, and you have the literal verbatim, I think, here from the original.
Right. But having studied the methodology and the results as stated, could you tell anything about the quality of the communication?
No, and again, in the report, obviously, I think that having a standard methodology and a more systematic approach that could be repeated building to building, I think would help significantly in generalising the insights from this fire.
And if we look at the third row, we could see that the same test was repeated with the channel 2 using leaky feeders and radio repeaters. And the messages were there described as being, quotes, clearly audible without signal loss. Yes? And in the fourth row, channel 1, there are 2 2s, I think, because one is a repetition of the other, but the fourth one being on number 3, channel 1 was tested with transmissions from the bridgehead locations, which was floor 0, 2, 4, and 7 of the tower, to all higher floors. And you can see that it was noted there that when the transmitting radio was at floor 0, there were various issues with transmission being received on floor 7, 10, 23 and the roof.
Yes.
Yes. Are you able to infer anything from the presence of those problems identified by the LFB here?
Almost nothing.
Right. Now, you go on at page 162, if we can turn the page, please, to section 6.14.4, to note, if you look at that paragraph there, the LFB's testing results document notes the findings from an additional test on UHF handheld radios with, and I'm summarising, the transmitting radio being established at floor 11, and that test resulted, I think, in clear messages being received on all higher floors. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Yes. So that's table 6.1. Let's look at table 6.2 a little bit lower down the same page. There it is, it's paragraph 6.14.6. And you've set out there the results of the testing of the Barry radio sets.
Yes.
First, is it right that those radios were only tested inside the tower rather than outside the tower or the surrounding area?
As far as I know.
And looking at the first row of that table, we can see the results for the testing of channel 6 as between the bridgehead locations and all channel floors, although I think the roof wasn't tested. Again, you can see that it's noted that where the transmitting radio is at floor 0, there were problems with transmissions being received on floors 13 and up to 16.
Yes.
And you have to turn, I think, to page 163 for that. If we could just flip to page 163 and make that clear, you can see that. Floor 16, slight signal loss, roof level not tested. Now, as with Channel 1 testing, are you able to infer anything from the presence of those problems identified by the LFB there?
No.
Looking at the second row, if we can go back a page, please, to page 162, the foot of the page, we can see that I call it the second row. It's actually it's called row 3. If you go back to page 163, this is Channel 2.
Yeah.
If you look at that, that's, again, I think, tests between the bridgehead locations and all the higher floors. Just as a clarification point, Channel 2, I think, was a backup incident command channel rather than a BA channel specifically allocated. Yes?
Yes.
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 Now, we looked earlier in your evidence at the fact that Channel 2 was set to 2 watts, as we saw, and required radio repeaters and leaky feeders. In the test, we can see described here at row 3, Channel 2,
Yes.
it looks as if this repeater was deployed at the command unit's location rather than in the building.
Yes.
Would it be right then to say that this test was seeking to replicate the impact of a fixed appliance repeater rather than the impact of portable repeaters?
That's my interpretation of this.
Yes. Now, the results of Channel 2 testing within the tower say this: Channel 2 transmission and reception was intermittent when leaving the atrium and proceeding within the central stairwell of the building up until reaching floor 3. From floor 3, communication was possible from within flats, but broken within the central stair core of the building. Are you able to infer anything from that finding?
No.
And if we go on to back to page 160 and look at section 6.14.1 again, we looked at this a moment ago, where we saw in the last paragraph, in the quotation under that paragraph, the view of the LFB that the communications problems on the night were predominantly caused by the volume of radio traffic. Having looked at what you've looked at and having now looked at the tests, are you able to shed any light on why it is or how it is that the LFB was able to come to that conclusion?
I think that they paid insufficient attention in reaching that conclusion to the caveats that were raised by their own people conducting the tests about the reliability of the tests, and also by the evidence of Commissioner Dobson to the Lakenhall Hall fire to the coroner,
Yes.
in terms of the reliability of these kinds of tests.
Yes, well, I think we'll come to that perhaps after the break at some stage, but we will do. But you're not able to tell. And let me put something to you. It's right, I think, that the LFB's tests had no introduced element of congestion.
No.
So they were demonstrating instances of poor reception at Grenfell Tower, even in a congestion-free environment.
Exactly.
Right. Now, let's look at page 163 and continue with this. At paragraph 6.14.8, you say this: however, the LFB's post-incident review of radio communications had a number of important limitations, and we can see those identified fivefold. First of all, the lack of any confirmation that meteorological conditions were similar to those on the night of the fire. That's the first one. Second is the deployment of radio repeaters as part of the tests when they weren't successfully deployed on the night. Yes?
Yes.
I'm so sorry to do this to you, but when you nod, if you would say yes...
Oh, I'm really sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, I normally give witnesses a bit of training when they first come into the witness box, and I'm afraid I failed to do that.
I apologise.
But if you nod or shake your head, it doesn't go onto the transcript.
Of course, I apologise. Sorry.
It's quite all right. It's my fault.
I'm still learning. So.
That's the second one. The third, I think, is the difference between the tower's materials during the fire as compared with how the materials stood after the fire when the testing took place?
Yes.
Yes. The fourth is the failure to replicate or account for any interference caused by other radio or mobile telecommunication systems.
Yes.
And I think the fifth one is the inability to replicate the effect of the fire itself, which would have an influence, but we don't quite know how yet because the science isn't sufficiently developed. Yes. Now, to some extent, those limitations are highlighted, I think, in documents accompanying the testing results. And if you go to page 164, we'll see how you deal with that. You say this at section 6.14.9, and you say the LFB's reporting of its post-incident testing notes a number of caveats and restrictions associated with the methodology for post-incident tests are set out below. Particular attention should be paid to the second paragraph. And in the second paragraph, there's some underlining, and it says the information contained within this document and subsequent test results should not be read as taken as a true and accurate reflection of how LFB radio communications performed during the incident. And that underlining is in the original document.
No, that's my underlining.
That's yours, is it?
Yes, it says emphasis added in parenthesis at the very bottom.
Right.
I think it's particularly
I missed
important.
that. It's in a different paragraph.
Apologies.
Right. Now, it goes on to say, tests are being carried out at a time when the fabric of the building has significantly altered from that encountered at the outset of the original incident. Certain structural elements are no longer present, and significant amounts of the building covering and internal fabric are now missing, all of which combined with the prevailing conditions, both outside and inside the building, together with the high number of users, may have affected, the ability of personnel to send and receive messages via incident ground radio systems. And again, this is an extract from the post-incident testing methodology. Now, in the light of the limitations that you've identified, those 5 we saw a moment ago, and this passage by the LFB itself, how reliable do you consider the LFB's testing results to be?
Purely indicative and not reliable in terms of the argument that's presented.
And when you say purely indicative, can you just explain what that means?
I think they provide an impression of what they found on a particular day that doesn't replicate in almost every respect what was actually experienced on the night of the fire.
Now, can we go back to page 82 of your report, please, where you say this at section 4.14.4. You say this systematic analysis of interactions between building construction, signal localization, interference and congestion during the Lacknell House fire and the Grenfell Tower fire provides a more convincing explanation of BA Communications' failure in high-rise concrete buildings, rather than an explanation focusing narrowly on the number of BA crews committed. Now, that conclusion is, as you put it, expressed as a more convincing explanation. What is your opinion when considered on the balance of probabilities, more likely than not?
I strongly believe this assertion rather than one that is purely based on congestion. And I would evidence that by the national GR 3.2 policy that says you have to be aware of blind spots in communication in high-rise buildings, which is not mentioned in the previous quote from the post-incident review.
And on what you've seen, Professor, do you consider that the materials on Grenfell Tower were more likely than not to have played a relevant part in signal propagation problems experienced on the night of the fire?
Yes.
Yes. And so what is your overall view about the LFB's conclusion that the communications problems on the night of the fire can be predominantly attributed to congestion or the number of radio messages being sent?
I think it provides at the very best a partial explanation of the problems that were experienced. And if any attempt is to make that to be a substantive argument, then there needs to be additional evidence provided.
And you've seen none?
I've not seen any that would convince me that that alone was the explanation.
And would that explain why the failure by the LFB to mention congestion issues and focusing on? Well, let me ask it this a different way. Can we look at the LFB's 2019 review, This is at LFB 00105466. That's the document you've expressed a view about. Review of the specification for fire ground and breathing apparatus radios dated the 29th of October 2019. And if we then look at page 165 of your report, you say this at section 6.15.2. You say, in contrast, LFB's review of its specification for fire ground and breathing apparatus radios dated October 2019 focuses exclusively on radio power issues and does not mention the impact of congestion. This is despite power issues having been largely disregarded by the LFB as a potential explanation for the communication problems experienced on the night of the fire. Now, can you just explain why that's significant?
I just felt that there was a tension at the very best between a focus on congestion being an explanation for communication problems, and yet the specification documents looking on radio power issues rather than on congestion.
And have you seen anything to resolve that tension in anything you've seen?
It remains a question in my mind as to what the balance is between those two issues and what going forward is the principal means of avoiding that this doesn't happen again.
If you look a little bit lower down the same page at section 6.15.4 on the screen, and I should just point out this is under the general heading at 6.15 lessons learned, you say neither of these responses adopts the systemic view I have advocated throughout this report for the following reasons. And when you say that the approach to its specification fails to adopt a systemic view, could you just explain to us what you mean by that?
I think that, as I've tried to argue, that the devices, whether they're intrinsically safe or not, and which channel allocations you use or not, raise different issues in different benefits in different ways, and that the policies have to be tailored to the characteristics of the devices that are present. And then the difficult questions that arise from your choice of specification need to be addressed, and either through training, for instance, or in the case of the building construction, through more rigorous and methodological on-site inspections to prepare people for communication failures. So if you were to argue that an intrinsically safe device has significant benefits for the use of firefighting in high-rise buildings, which is a reasonable argument, you then need to deal with what mitigations would you put into place when large numbers of firefighters enter that building on the same channel and are working in close proximity. What would happen if you allow backup channels or alternative channels, as was the coroner's suggestion in the previous incident? How do you then deal with firefighters potentially becoming isolated because they were on a previous channel rather than the one that you're moving to, and so forth? So if all you do is focus on intrinsic safety, then I think, and say these devices are safe because they're intrinsically safe, and the only problems arise through users not obeying radio discipline, etc., I think that shows a huge misappreciation of the problems that were experienced by the firefighters on the night of this fire.
Professor, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, thank you very much. It is. Well, Professor Johnson, we will all get a break now so we can have some lunch. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And as before, please don't discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone over the break.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you go to the usher then, please? Thank you very much. 2 o'clock then, please.